you. Sorry about that. Probably the time that I use this discussion on temperaments is when I do marital or premarital counseling. And I'll talk a little bit about where that fits into things, but the temperament model. So I have entitled it Ask the Animals, and sometimes people resemble animals. I read the story about a teacher who was taking a class on a tour of the zoo, and the teacher, pointing to a deer, turned to one of her students and said, "Johnny, do you know what kind of animal that is?" Johnny was a little bewildered and confused. He was a little too young to know all of the animals, and he was a little embarrassed being in front of the class, so he admitted that at that moment he did not know what animal that was that the teacher was pointing to. But the teacher, being persistent, convinced that he actually knew what kind of animal this was, and she said, "Well, here's a hint, Johnny. Think of a name that perhaps your mother calls your father." And the light bulb came on immediately for Johnny. He said, "Oh, that's what a big, ugly gorilla looks like." So anyway, but there are a variety of personality models that exist out there. All of them have certain elements of truth. And basically the way that I see it is that they're tools that we can use as those who study human behavior have observed the patterns of behavior that exist in the lives of people, and have tried to find ways to systematize those so that we can better understand the people that we work with and better understand ourselves. I would give a warning, however, that these models of behavior that we look at are not specifically spiritual or scriptural models, and that no individual fits into specifically this any one box that has all of these boundaries. We ought to consider that we're fearfully, wonderfully made, uniquely designed by a creator, and that that all of us break molds in one way or another. But here's what I think, is that since they are tools, that we can use them. We should know that these tools have limitations, but here's what we do. First of all, you want to think about applying it to yourself. As you think about any of these models for understanding behavior, the idea behind a temperament model, for example, is that in the temperament model, your temperament is deeper than your personality. It is an element of your character which drives your personality and drives your responses throughout your life. As your personality may change throughout your life, your temperament remains the same. And also your personality may change in given situations, but that's going to be informed by your temperament. Also, another thing is that you likely inherited your temperament from your parents. And that's one of the things that I like about understanding and studying these things, is because we don't use these things to blame our parents, but to understand how we developed. We understand that there are certain qualities and characteristics that are passed down genetically. I, in fact, believe this concerning sin. That the Bible tells us that wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men for that all have sinned, we inherited a sin nature from our parents, and it's passed down, I believe, genetically. And so when your parents perhaps have a predisposition toward a particular kind of sin, that you're likely to have that, and also to pass it along to your children. And so sin kind of comes in families sometimes. What do you do with that information? Well, we never use those things to excuse our behavior, but we use those things to help us to understand and explain our behavior. It helps us understand why we do what we do. It also helps us to understand the kinds of standards that we set up in our lives to separate ourselves and to be careful about certain temptations that we might face that are unique to us. And Romans 14:12, though, reminds us, so then every one of us shall give an account of himself to God. So we never want to excuse our behavior, but we do need to understand that statistically, those who are born into the family of an alcoholic may have a predisposition toward drinking themselves. Someone whose family has a history of adultery is statistically likely to have that same struggle. So when you're aware of that, you don't use that as an excuse for you to go out and take opportunity towards sin, but you use it as an understanding to help you to understand why you need to run away from sin and what you need to be careful of. Then the next thing is you want to learn to apply it to others. I think all of us need to realize that God has given us the ministry of reconciliation. And when we can understand the patterns of behavior that exist in the lives of other people around us, then we can find ways to help them along in their Christian journey, encouraging them, helping them, counseling them, and ministering to them. But also this, Philippians 2, verses 2 through 3, tell us to be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind, and tells us this: let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. In part of an act and ministry of humility in our own lives, it's helpful for us to be able to recognize the strengths that exist in the lives of other people, and to be able to see those. But also, though, when we think of helping others, when we find ways to fortify the weaknesses in the lives of other people, we can find our success in life by making other people successful. Zig Ziglar said, the way to get what you want in life is to help enough other people get what they want. And when we learn to help strengthen and lift up the hands of other people, then we will find joy and fulfillment in our lives, as we find there in Philippians chapter 2. And then also, as we think about applying it to other people, consider this. It helps us to understand how to treat other people on the basis of how they want to be treated. I think that oftentimes we think of treating other people the way we want to be treated, but that comes from our own makeup. When we take time to study how other people operate, we learn to treat them how they want to be treated. Luke 6:31, and as you would that men should do to you, do ye also to them likewise. And what I would want other people to do for me is I would want them to take the time to get to know me and treat me the way I want to be treated, right? And so that helps us when we learn how other people function. Think about when when my wife and I were dating, that I planned our dates on the basis of the way I would want somebody to plan dates if they were going on a date with me. And that is that I would want them to plan the date, right? And that would be, I would and so what happened was she flew out to California to visit with me, and I had us going to every mall in the Bay Area, and then walking all over the city of San Francisco together and seeing every single site that there was to see in this action-packed 5-day experience or whatever it was. And by the end of it, she was pretty exhausted, and I had spent thousands of dollars just dragging her all over the Bay Area. And I asked her, I said, what was your favorite thing that we did? She said, well, I liked it when we sat on the couch and watched videos, and then when we walked around your neighborhood and talked. And I thought, this ungrateful person, I've spent thousands of dollars, and the thing she liked the most was what cost us nothing. And I realized that what I did was that I superimposed the things that I like on her. And so, this is like buying a gift that you like for yourself for somebody else, because you would like it. So this is the greatest expression of, but really what we should do if we are going to esteem others better than self is we need to take time to get to know them and learn to understand and appreciate what they like and how they see the world. And so I think that makes a very obvious liaison, not just into others in general, but specifically in our marriage relationship and with our children, learning to understand them. But specifically, though, the relationship of the spouse. Ephesians 5:25-31 says, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men also to love their wives as their own bodies. I want you to think about that. Loving someone else as you love yourself, as your own body. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh. Think about this. They two shall be one, is what the Bible teaches concerning marriage. And why is it, for example, in the Bible that God did not kill Job's wife? I mean, you look at the story, that could have been helpful, But it was because God told Satan that he couldn't harm Job. And by virtue of the fact that these two were one, he couldn't take her away either. And so what the Bible teaches us, though, as men, for example, when we love our wives, is that we nourish and cherish her as we would ourselves. And I think that takes some time. That means taking time to get to know her. 1 Peter 3, verse number 7 says, "Likewise, you husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered." When I was speaking on this particular topic at our church of the temperaments and understanding one another and so on, I did it in a series of lessons, and one of the lessons that I did was the difference between men and women. And the thing is that in the Bible, women are never commanded to understand their husband, because husbands don't care if they're understood or not, unless they're melancholy, and we'll get to that later. But they don't care if they're understood or not. But women want to be understood. I remember I grew up with, it was my mom and my sister, and my dad was gone all the time because he was a truck driver. So there was a lot of estrogen just floating around in the air around our house. And I remember the major complaint from my sister when she was a teenage girl in high school is, nobody understands me. And I didn't understand why that mattered. Because as a guy, I'm just like, who cares? But for her, this is just devastating to be lonely and this isolated. So I think this is incredibly important, men, as we think about this, for being able to understand our wives, that we're commanded to dwell with them according to knowledge. And so I think as we think about applying this, think about how it applies to yourself. But the Bible says in Proverbs that the fool loves wisdom so that his heart can discover itself. We need to think about how we can apply it to other people, our coworkers, but mostly in our spousal relationship, being able to truly understand that one that God has given to us. Now, as we present these, I want you to understand that typically a person has a mix of them. You'll have a dominant, and then you'll have like a secondary. And I typically like to look at like a 60-40 mix on those, 60% you're one and 40% you're another, because I think that's a helpful way to be able to understand it without complicating all the idiosyncrasies for all the different other patterns and categories. You're dominantly a particular category and subdominantly perhaps another. And I'll tell you in advance, so that if you feel like I'm being really hard on one or another, I'm a choleric sanguine, primarily choleric, secondarily sanguine. We'll look at what that means in just a moment. And so we start with the choleric. And I think it's easy to see the choleric as represented by a lion, because the choleric's natural strengths are that he's a natural born leader. He tends to be aggressive. He's a type A driven personality. When I think of these, I sometimes think of the characters from Winnie the Pooh, because we can relate to them. And Rabbit was kind of a choleric. He was very compulsive in nature and always demanding and that kind of thing. The choleric always has to be doing something. And if he's going to do something, he is going to get it done. It's going to be accomplished. It's got to be checking it off of the list. He's very accomplishment oriented. And he isn't going to be the kind of person who's interested in repetitive, mundane tasks which have to be completed on a regular basis. If he's going to do it, it's going to be done once and for all. So the choleric, the way that he'll mow his grass is that he'll go outside with a plow and just turn it under, because then the grass is done permanently, or at least for a little while, until he has time to go and do the grass again, because he doesn't just mow the grass, he does the grass, And then if he's going to trim the bushes, he is going to cut them down to the stump that can come up from the bottom. You do it once and it's done. Typically what happens with this person is that if he's going to do the laundry, just take it outside, burn it, go buy new clothes, you're done. It's all about finishing stuff. It's about completing things. It's about having it finalized. Finish the task and move on is the way that he does life. But the reason that he operates this way is because he typically lives life as a bulldozer. He tends to, if he's not careful, he tends to plow over anybody who gets in his way and become angry. And the besetting sin or tendency with the choleric is to put programs and projects over people, and to value accomplishment and achievement more than he values relationships. Cholerics oftentimes tend to marry phlegmatics. And when we learn about a phlegmatic, phlegmatics tend to be very steady and do not easily jump from one thing to another. So cholerics tend to fixate on something and then move on to something else over a period of time. And as a result, phlegmatics have a hard time following along with this very erratic sort of behavior because that's not how they operate. Some warnings that I would give to cholerics is to be careful not to take advantage of seemingly quiet or weaker personalities. Because the tendency is that in all of this brute strength that the choleric can tend to exhibit, they learn how to be manipulative in their behavior and how to overpower other people so that they get their way. And the problem is that when you have a child or a spouse who maybe has a quieter personality, that they do feel you running over them on a regular basis, and as a result, builds tension and rifts in the relationship that continue to grow over time. And you have to be careful that you exercise meekness. Meekness is not weakness, but it is power under control. And when you have this power in your life that you're a natural born leader, what you have to allow the Holy Spirit to do is to reel that in and to speak to your heart when you're taking advantage of your spouse. For example, in our relationship, I am a choleric, and my wife is a phlegmatic. And what I knew very early on in our relationship was that I could get my way with a lot of stuff. And because she grew up in a household where her dad is the leader of the home, and everybody respects her dad, and when he makes a statement that they're going to do a particular thing, then that's what the family does. And as a child, she didn't have a voice always for what was going to be done. It was finally decided. And that's fine. It's how their household operated, and it was healthy for them, and she was a child anyway. But when I married her, though, she entered into our marriage with that same sort of mentality where it was like, well, if I spoke, which I'm a verbal processor, and that's a whole different thing when you get into verbal and internal processing. But I'm a verbal processor, I tend to think out loud. So she thought every statement that I made that was brainstorming was what we were going to do, was the law of the Medes and the Persians. And then and we'd get into these arguments when we first got married, just kind of like, because I couldn't understand why she couldn't just talk with me. And she couldn't understand why I wanted to do something different every other 5 seconds. But I was just brainstorming. And I learned that if I wasn't careful, we could always go to the restaurant that I wanted to go to because she was never going to say anything about it. But what I learned to do was that if I instead controlled this seemingly powerful behavior and brought it in and exercised the spirit of meekness, submitting ourselves one to another, and allowing my wife to have a voice in our marriage instead of overpowering her, that what that did was that over time she became increasingly confident about expressing what she wanted to do because I showed deference and respect to her desires and to what she desired. And so that can be brought into a healthy balance. We need to be careful about those things if you are a choleric. Statistically, cholerics, if they don't get saved at an early age, will never likely trust Christ as their Savior. Typically, they say before the age of 10 because of this kind of personality that they have to want to be independent. And salvation requires us to recognize our dependence upon the Lord and things that we cannot do on our own. I would write a prescription for cholerics. I would recommend that cholerics, as they take the fruit of the Spirit, that they take a heavy dose of meekness, love, gentleness, and goodness, and learn to value people over projects. Most likely, choleric spiritual gifts are typically ruling and leadership, if you read Romans chapter 12. And Paul, the apostle, was most likely choleric. But we see how the personality of the apostle was shaped and developed by the Holy Spirit of God throughout his ministry and his life. As an unregenerate choleric, he was persecuting the church. And you can see him list all of his achievements and his accomplishments in Philippians chapter 3. But when he looked at Christ, when he understood what it meant to be saved, he said that he counted all those things but dung. That those achievements and those accomplishments outside of Christ meant nothing. But instead, what we see is that as he continued progressing in his life, he no longer relied on his own achievements and his accomplishments, but that which was completed by Christ. And in addition to that, what we see is that constantly, Paul's letters are filled with people, not programs and not projects, but the fact that he loved others. And then, next of all, I want you to see the sanguine. And the sanguine is represented by the otter. So when you think about a sanguine, you can think of someone who's fun-loving, who's the life of the party, and who enjoys life. I'm primarily choleric, I'm secondarily sanguine, and the weaknesses, however, of the sanguine are that the sanguine is often over-impulsive, overindulgent, and lacks temperance or self-control in his life. He has this party animal tendency. And while he can be a lot of fun and he makes lots of new friends, oftentimes those friendships tend to be very shallow because he doesn't have the discipline necessary to continue cultivating relationships over a long period of time. He moves on to new tasks, often without completing previous ones. Sanguines can be identified easily by the fact that their offices look like a huge wreck, filled with unfinished tasks. They're constantly enjoying something that they're involved in the moment, and they're excited about that, but when the ADD kicks in, they're over here somewhere else doing something entirely different that they're also just as excited about. And when they leave the office by the end of the day, they have not accomplished anything. And in their moments of introspection, which are very limited, they feel a little defeated and discouraged because they have not completed their tasks. They haven't gotten things done. And they think about that, feel bad about themselves for about 5 minutes, and then they go on and indulge in something else. Sanguines make great salespeople. They can sell ice to igloos. And oftentimes sanguines are easily identifiable because they are usually on the portly side of things. Their overindulgence and stuff, their lack of self-discipline drives them to the point where they just love indulging in their appetites. And so they're usually the people down at the buffet, and they waddle in and enjoy their meals, sit there for long hours and have great conversation, and then go home and wonder why they're so large. Sanguines, the way that a sanguine mows the lawn is that he doesn't have time to maintain a lawn because he has to have parties on his front lawn. The lawns are not for growing grass. Lawns are for throwing parties. This is where you put all the lawn chairs and the barbecue and so on. Sanguines tend to marry melancholies, which is a good combination because the melancholy is always down and the sanguine's always up. So this gives them both a project for one another to sort of reach some point of equilibrium if they don't kill one another. And usually it would be the melancholy killing the sanguine because the sanguine doesn't see the anger. There's no time for bitterness. You just move on to the next thing. But the melancholy can see the bitterness for the rest of his or her miserable life if they choose to. Peter most likely was a sanguine. He had a tendency to speak his mind and just talk and move on to the next thing. When he was in the middle of stuff, he'd just give in to his urges and so on. And another sanguine in the Bible now Peter was a sanguine whose life was changed by the Lord Jesus Christ. So we see a transformed sanguine in the book of Acts when Peter steps up to speak. But Samson was a sanguine whose life ended tragically, one that was never brought into balance, and one that was never brought into submission and controlled by God. He was witty, he was clever, he was the life of the party, but he was given to his appetites, and as a result was consumed by them. For the sanguine, I would recommend that you exercise meekness and temperance. It's going to be all about submitting yourself to the Spirit's control and allowing the Holy Spirit to bring balance and temperance into your life. Also learning to exercise faith, because faith in the scriptures is emphasized by longevity. And you see, oftentimes what we think of as faith is this big courageous act in a particular moment when we get excited about something. But you see, character takes us from the moment of our decision to the point of carrying it out over a long period of time when it no longer seems expedient to us and the circumstances are much more challenging or difficult. Faith causes us to believe God continually rather than just momentarily. And in the Bible, what you'll find concerning faith is this, that the Bible speaks of great faith, Remember the man who came to Jesus and believed Jesus to heal his son from a distance because he was a man who was under authority. And Jesus said, I have not seen so great faith, no, not in Israel. So we think his faith was large. But then we hear about small faith. So we think about little faith. So large faith or little faith. You think Jesus praised this man for his large faith. And then he talked about how that you could move mountains with if you had faith that's only the grain of a mustard seed. So faith apparently is so powerful that it doesn't have to be in large quantities. But what is the difference between this large faith and this small faith? When Jesus stepped out, though, rebuked the disciples and told them that they were men of little faith. Think about Peter. He was a man who Jesus said had little faith. But he stepped out of the boat and walked on water. How many of you have ever done that? How many of you would have gotten out of the boat? And mind you, there were more disciples there that day, but Peter was the one who actually got out of the boat. He was the one who had enough faith to step out of the water. We would say that's large faith, but Jesus said it was little faith. And what was the difference between Peter's faith and the faith of others? Well, I believe that it speaks more of the duration than the amount. This year, our theme in our church is Great is Thy Faithfulness, and faithfulness requires faith-filledness. It's the continuation of that faith over a period of time. How would you move a mountain? Well, one rock at a time. And even if you had a little bit of faith, if it was continual faith, you could move mountains. So I'm not trying to mean that doesn't seem that there would be miraculous, but I don't know, moving a mountain even one stone at a time would seem pretty miraculous to me. But sanguines need to learn how to exercise that constancy, and so do cholerics. I want you to see the melancholy is the beaver. The melancholy and his strengths are that he is diligent. He has great attention to detail. Oftentimes, melancholies can be incredibly artistic and creative, as well as sanguines can as well. Sanguines, for example, when they tell a story, they don't just tell a story, they relive it in front of you, They can be incredibly creative. But for the melancholy, it's more of a science than an art, It's creativity at its finest. It's the attention to detail. And then also the depth of thought. Melancholies can get lost in their thought for hours and hours on end, just thinking about things and meditating on stuff and so on. But the problem is that their perfectionism and their desire for perfectionism can prevail everything else. And as a result, it creates a struggle in their life because they want things to be exact. They want things to be perfect, and they want things to be black and white. But unfortunately, the world's not designed that way. We live in a fallen world. And besides, when we think about perfectionism, really, you need to be able to think about this. Is it really perfect, or is it just your version of perfect that you're looking for? And when we focus on ideals, those will never be achieved. And so the melancholy has to be careful because the greatest weaknesses are the very fact that the word melancholy is synonymous with gloom and sadness and despair and depression. And melancholies can be a little bit of a challenge for me personally because I'm a choleric, sanguine, so I just don't get all of the doom and gloom and depression and all these things. Like, I just think, man, pick yourself up, it'll be great, you can move on. My choleric tendency forges ahead like a bulldozer, and my sanguine tendency doesn't allow me to fixate on anything for very long. And so, but for the melancholy, it's kind of like, if they're not careful, they can allow their entire being to be sucked into this giant gaping black hole and just live there. And what happens is that in the midst of that, what they're really doing is indulging their own emotions rather than, they don't want to be brought out of the black hole because they kind of like it there. And that's weird to a sanguine because they want to indulge in happiness all the time, so they don't want to focus on the negativity. But for the melancholy, the same rise the sanguine gets out of being happy and like focusing on like all the positivity all the time, the melancholy gets out of focusing on like the sadness and the negativity. Like that just like, but it's a bad place to be, right? To feed on those things, and it drives people to, it's self-reciprocating. The way that the sanguine would do the laundry, well, I told you the choleric would just burn it and buy all new laundry. The sanguine would play basketball and then shoot the hoops, it would land on the side of the hamper, and there it would stay for days, years maybe. It doesn't matter. But until their melancholy comes by to pick it up. But the melancholy would neatly fold the laundry and place it inside the hamper in order by color, even though it's dirty laundry. They are going to stack all of their garbage neatly inside the garbage bin so that it all fits perfectly, so that they can take it out at its appointed, scheduled time. The melancholy, when they do their lawn, they're going to go outside and trim every bush exactly, perfectly shaped. And then they're going to cut the lawn, not with a lawnmower, but with a pair of scissors, and make sure that every blade is exactly even. And then when they realize that every blade is not exactly even, they will go inside, close all the windows and drapes, open their diary, journal for a little while, and have a good cry. David most likely was melancholy. He spent a lot of time alone in deep meditation. He expressed all of his emotions and feelings for us. He was a man after God's own heart, and his heart is available for us on all the pages of the Psalms to read. But if I were going to write a prescription for the melancholy, I would recommend faith. We all need faith, obviously, but the way that faith is going to help a melancholy is to be able to see God, to see their circumstances through God and not God through their circumstances. It's going to allow them to look past the clouds and see the sunshine on the other side, to realize that even though you go through storms, that it takes storms to make a rainbow. It takes clouds to make a lovely sunset. It takes faith to look beyond the present, to see how God has operated in the past, to give us hope for the future. Also, the fruit of the Spirit is joy. And joy can manifest itself in any circumstance or situation. We can have joy even in the most awful difficulties. And peace. We can have peace in the midst of storms. The Lord gives us peace that passes all understanding. And so these are the things that we should meditate on. These are the things that we should focus on. The spiritual gift of the choleric is likely that he is a ruler or a leader. The spiritual gift of the sanguine is that most likely his strongest spiritual gift is going to be exhortation. The most likely spiritual gift of the melancholy is going to be service. They like to serve, and they like to find value in doing their work accurately and efficiently and as perfectly as they can do it, and excellently. And finally, I want you to look at the phlegmatic. The phlegmatic can be represented by the golden retriever. And I especially like this picture of the golden retriever here for the phlegmatic, because the phlegmatic, you can think of this as a faithful friend. The phlegmatic is loyal, is steady, is a plodder, is even-tempered. They love consistency. They love routines. My grandpa is a phlegmatic, and he wakes up the exact same time every single day without an alarm clock. And he goes to the exact same breakfast spot every single day, like clockwork, the exact same time. He meets with the exact same people, and he has that same group of friends, and he's been meeting with them for breakfast for years and years and years at that exact spot. He's retired now, but he still drives over to the church, and he has an office that they gave to him. We're so thankful that the pastor there provided an office for him and asked him to stay on staff and gave him some responsibilities, because so much of his identity is tied up in his routine. And we were afraid of what it would look like for him if he retired and his routine was going to change. And my wife is a phlegmatic. She wakes up at the exact same time every day without an alarm clock and follows the exact same morning rituals without, you could set a clock by it every single day. She does the exact same thing. She's just steady, and she's a plodder. And that those all sound like strengths to me because they're the things I lack in both of my areas of I'm a choleric and a sanguine. But I realize though, when we think about the fact that in marriage we're completers and not competers, that I see that those are strengths that I need and that she provides that stability for me. And for example, I think I went to like 5 or 6 elementary schools by the time I was in 2nd grade. And then 9th grade, I went to public school from K-5 to 8th grade. I was in a Christian school 9th grade, public school 10th grade. Christian homeschool 10th grade, public school 11th grade, Christian school 12th grade. I went to PCC, transferred to West Coast. I was there 2 years, went to South Carolina, moved back to California. And when I was in California, I started dating Elena. I went back to South Carolina for 6 months, went to seminary for 2 years. Basically, in the last decade of my life, Bible Baptist Church is the longest I've been anywhere. And we're going on just a little past 4 years now. But see, some of that was I do believe God's leading in my life, but also though, it created a longing for stability that I don't think I would have appreciated had I not had those experiences and God brought Elena into my life. So I recognize those things in my life helping me to be what God would have me to be because of an area of weakness that God had an answer for, and that was her. But there are some weaknesses that go along with this, with being a phlegmatic. Phlegmatics tend toward laziness and selfishness. If they're not careful, they can become very laid back and so set in their routine that they don't want their routine interrupted, and can sometimes become a little angry when you try to interrupt their routine. If they're not careful, can begin to think of their own personal convenience and comfort ahead of the needs of others. Phlegmatics' personality is typically perfect for a dry sense of humor, and most famous comedians are phlegmatics. But also along with that can come a very haughty, sarcastic sort of personality where they pridefully look down on other people because of their wit and their wit and their repartee. And they have to be careful that they don't become arrogant in in the way that they think about things. Their tendencies also are that while sanguines make many friends, phlegmatics typically make a handful of very faithful friends and hold those perhaps even for a lifetime. The choleric will jump right in and get interested in something and launch it and get it started, but when his perspective changes and he's ready to move on to the next ADD project that he has, he needs phlegmatics and melancholies to stand in and fill in the gaps to make those systems work that he's set into place. Typically, phlegmatics are the reliable people who will get it done. They don't mind completing repetitive tasks over and over again. They don't need excitement. They don't need accomplishment. They just need routine. And as long as you can keep them in routine, that creates comfort for them. Routine discourages cholerics, on the other hand, because they feel like that they're stuck in a rut and that they're not getting anywhere because life is something to be accomplished. And for the sanguine, life is something to be enjoyed. So, variety is the spice of life. But for the melancholy, life is something to be perfected and completed, while for the phlegmatic, you just go through life. You don't have to ponder the deeper things. It's okay. You just move on. When phlegmatics are at their greatest, they can be wonderful teachers because they have the qualities that are necessary to show up to class every single day and to repeat the same things over and over again to ensure a pupil's education. Phlegmatics also can be excellent workers because they're reliable, dependable, and when they're not lazy or selfish, they can be hard workers that are fully devoted to the cause. Abraham was likely a phlegmatic because he woke up every single day and walked with God. So whatever it was that God was leading him to do, he didn't have to ponder the deeper questions of where they were going to end up or why. He just went along and was willing to faithfully follow God. And that's why God called him his friend. Abraham was a friend of God. And phlegmatic at its best can be a friend of God. If I were going to recommend a prescription for phlegmatic, though, it would be to accept the courage and the boldness that comes with faith to trust God for something greater and bigger. Phlegmatics oftentimes want safety and security and are afraid of being pushed outside of that comfort zone because they don't know how it's all going to turn out. That same excitement drives a choleric, but it scares the daylights out of a phlegmatic. But I would also recommend meekness as well. Not to express that haughtiness and not to think of themselves more highly than they ought, but to meekly and humbly learn to esteem others better than self. And finally, the phlegmatic's spiritual gift is most likely mercy, because they have a tendency, whereas the melancholy can be harsh and judgmental because people have to measure up to the standard of perfection, the phlegmatic, that's okay. They're easygoing, and they have the ability to forgive and to continue plodding along with life. It was just a bump in the road. We'll all get over it. Ultimately, though, here's what I want you to understand. Sometimes when I say, like, I'm a choleric, sanguine, I say those are my primary things, people who don't know me very well recognize certain characteristics in my life, and so they would say, I know my bus workers, for example, always thought that I was this huge perfectionist. And I think my choleric tendency tends to drive a high standard of excellence. But to be honest, I tend to be pretty pragmatic. I'm focused on just getting things done. So someone who's a casual observer of my life would say, oh, you're a melancholy. No, I'm not. I'm really not. And I play the piano and stuff, but even my piano playing, for example, is more of a representation of my personality. It's aggressive and it's pragmatic. I miss a lot of notes, but it's great. You know, I just have a good time because that's my sanguine personality. But a melancholy, when they play the piano, they've got to hit every accidental exactly right. All of the chords have to be precise. They hear it exactly the way it's supposed to be done, and they can hear exactly every mistake that somebody else makes, whatever. But where I'm going with that is this, that if there is constancy in my life, it's because the Lord has put that in me, and that I have to trust him for that. I was a verse that God used in my life as a choleric sanguine was, the double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And there are a lot of different layers of thoughts that go along with that particular verse, because I believe that has a lot to do with anxiety in the midst of storms because of what double-minded means and what anxiety is translated as in the scriptures. But the point I'm making is this, that I recognize that instability was not a quality that was exemplary of faithfulness or was constant with God's personality, and that he is the same yesterday, today, forever. So I had to ask God to help me a lot with that in my life, and it's something I have to trust him for constantly. And there are lots of other things too, you know, like the anger issue and stuff like that. I can have some real like rage problems if I don't allow the Holy Spirit to control that. Like I can wax pretty eloquent on the phone with customer service agent. Usually what happens for me though is that my vocabulary expands when I get mad and I start using bigger words, but I have to ask the Lord to reel that in. And the point that I'm making is this, that there is what I've shared with you are more or less caricatures of the extremities of these personalities. And the point is this, that when you allow the Holy Spirit to work in your life and you learn to walk in the Spirit, that what he does is he starts to bring you more toward the center of what you were intended to be in him. And one of the things that you'll find is that I gave you the personalities of many people in the scriptures, but I never once told you that Christ was one of these. And that's because you can look at the life of Christ and see various qualities. You see, the examination of Jesus' personality brings a lot of like confusion into our minds. That's why when he stood up and he asked them, he said, whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? There were a wide variety of responses. Here's what they said. Some say that you are Elijah. Think about Elijah. Elijah's kind of this John the Baptist personality, I think of the voice crying in the wilderness, that, they confused John the Baptist and Elijah with one another. They thought that Elijah came back and John the Baptist and so on. There are a lot of prophecies and things you could discuss regarding that. But the point is this: Elijah, when he came to the king, it was never good news. I would say Elijah maybe was primarily choleric, but he came and and we see kind of a melancholy episode in his life, so secondarily that, but he came and blasted the king, and he was, and you see him performing all these great exploits and just doing all this stuff, and like just this dynamic, bombastic person, and just a really like coarse individual, But then they said, but some say that you're Jeremiah's. And think about this though, are Jeremiah and like Elijah the same? I mean, we see a little bit of a melancholy personality with Elijah like pouting under the juniper tree, but only after he got really like tired and hungry. But Jeremiah was the weeping prophet. I mean, like this guy's definitely a melancholy. Like that's definitely his primary thing. But in Jesus, they saw this dichotomy of his being, that he was on totally opposite ends of the spectrum. Both this like really dynamic, outgoing person, but also this like incredibly introverted, introspective person. But then they really couldn't figure it out, so they said, or one of the prophets. And so what do you see in Jesus? Well, here's what I see. I see that, and then Jesus said concerning himself, that they said when John the Baptist came, he came fasting, and they said he had a zeal. But when Jesus came, he came eating and drinking, and they said that he was a glutton and a winebibber. What were they saying? They're saying Jesus is a party animal. So over here's a sanguine. Who is Jesus? Well, in Jesus we find perfection. In perfection, there's completion. And there are strengths that are represented in all of these personalities, but there are weaknesses. What we need to see is that our strengths and our weaknesses are oftentimes connected with one another, but in Jesus, there's only strength. And so what we find represented in him are the perfect examples of the way that you and I should follow after him. And what we'll find is that in Christ we are complete. And I talked about how my wife is a completer, and in a certain sense she is. She is in help that is meet for me, or a helper who's adequate for me. But the Bible tells us that we're complete in Christ. And if you're a single person, for example, you're not wandering around with half of you missing just because you're not married. Literally, though, our completion, our maturity, our perfection is found in him. And so when we think about these personality traits, or we think about these temperament qualities, what we need to do is we need to spend time examining the Lord. And when we look into the mirror of God's word and we think about our temperament, we find areas of weakness, and we need to be careful that we don't become proud of those things. Sometimes in studying these personality things, like I said, the fool delights in wisdom so that his heart cannot discover itself or understand itself, is that this idea, this attitude of like, let me look at these things so that I can boast to the world about like my unique personality. Like, this is how I look at the world, and this is just like so awesome that I'm me, But it's really not about that. Like, often what we really should be looking at is like this: there are strengths and there are weaknesses. How can I find ways to lift up other people and to help them? And how can I become more like the Lord Jesus Christ and allow him to balance these things out in my life? Because even the things that are strengths for us, an unguarded strength can be a double weakness. And we need to make sure that even our strengths are yielded to the Lord. Well, let's